Hey everybody, it's Tom Woods, January 19th, 2012. I wanted to direct this video in particular to Catholics looking at the slate of candidates in 2012 and trying to make a decision. And whether you agree with me or not, I hope you'll at least just listen all the way through and consider what I've got to say, because I think this is some legitimate food for thought. I want to talk about Rick Santorum and Ron Paul. And I know a lot of Rick Santorum supporters, and I understand the arguments that they've made in support of their guy. But I want to go through and raise some cautionary points in your mind. First is the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. And many of the people watching this video will know what that is. It's that every task should be performed by the lowest possible unit of society. And only when that unit is incapable of performing the task do we then delegate it to a so-called higher order of society. So in other words, you don't right off the bat give the federal government authority over education, for example. That would be in complete defiance of subsidiarity. But when we look at Rick Santorum, he's voting to double the size of the Federal Department of Education, and he voted for the No Child Left Behind Act of Teddy Kennedy. Now, supposedly he regrets this now. Well, they all regret things conveniently right around the time they're running for office, but if you understand Catholic doctrine, there's just no way you could have been led to support this one way or the other. Forget about regrets later on about how it turned out. The point is that this is a complete defiance of subsidiarity, and there's a whole lot of this sort of thing of trying to establish a federal role for things that really belong to the states, to localities, to parents, in Santorum's record. Now, in terms of social issues, well, Santorum's trying to say Ron Paul's not really pro-life, but here's a guy who delivered 4,000 babies personally and who wrote a book called Abortion and Liberty in the early 1980s. You can find it online. It's got a foreword by C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General under Ronald Reagan, who testifies to Ron Paul's unimpeachable pro-life stance. Ron Paul's view is that instead of promising and making pretty speeches, you can overturn Roe versus Wade right away by having the Congress strip the courts of jurisdiction over abortion, which is allowable under the Constitution, so why not just go ahead and do it, and then you'd get to see whether your representatives really are supporting your view on abortion or not, once and for all. But in terms of other social issues, including marriage, I think it's exceedingly unwise for Catholics to be looking to the federal government to solve their problems. I think after the French Revolution, post-1789, people who believe in traditional values ought to have learned something, that governments can turn on you just like that, and they have the mechanisms to carry out social revolutions. It's much better for us to have a paradigm shift right now and to remember that marriage belongs properly to the custodianship of civil society, not to government. And Catholics especially should know this. All through the centuries of Christendom, it would have been considered an intolerable intrusion into the Church's jurisdiction for the state to take charge of marriage, defining it and codifying it in one way or another. This is not the state's area. The French Revolution began to insist that the state had to codify and approve marriage for it to be considered legitimate. And of course, traditionalists thought this was an appalling development. But unfortunately, a lot of conservatives act like this. If some left-wing innovation goes on long enough, then the conservatives will defend it as something conservative. But this is not conservative. So it's much, much better to think in terms of a ground-up approach to changing the world in ways that you want, rather than this top-down one that can go the other way and turn on a dime on you very quickly. Then in terms of the budget, now Ron Paul has got an actual line-by-line budget proposal. It cuts $1 trillion in the first year. Santorum is terrible on this issue. Let's be honest in terms of voting to raise the debt limit and his record of spending. It's not good. And we are facing a catastrophe. This isn't like some side issue that serious Catholics don't care about the budget, all we care about are other things. Nobody who understands the extent of the crisis we're facing could make a statement like that. We're facing a society-changing, wrenching series of changes to our lives coming up, given that the entitlement programs are underfunded by an amount greater than the GDP of 2 planet Earths. And Santorum has zero credibility on this issue. Nothing's going to change under him. It'll be another George W. Bush of a whole lot more spending while giving speeches about limited government. I mean, been there, done that. Our kids can't afford this. Our society, our civilization can't afford this. We need somebody who's honest and serious and has credibility on this issue, and that's clearly Ron Paul. But above all, foreign policy. Now here, I used to be like a lot of conservative Catholics. If the government in Washington told me that some bad guy needed to be gotten, then I jumped on board and rah, 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 and I was all in favor of it. And all my skepticism of government went right out the window as soon as it turned to foreign policy. And so I understand why that's your instinct. You naturally want to rally to the cause. I understand that. But I'm going to ask you for a minute to not do that, to think clearly through these issues. You are first a Catholic, and then you are other things. You are not first an American. And it was Pope John Paul II who said that the war in Iraq had no moral justification. Now, it's true this is a prudential judgment, but I rather think John Paul II is a better moral theologian than George W. Bush. And we must consider the counsel of the popes, John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, who have spoken out against these wars. And moreover, when we look at the Santorum position, look at what he said about Iran in 1953. In 1953, the U.S. government installed the awful Shah of Iran on those poor people. Now, I can at least understand somebody saying to me, well, for strategic reasons, we had to put this terrible guy in, but it was necessary for American security. I don't agree with that, but at least it's coherent. But in one of the debates, Santorum said, well, when he was faced with this objection, he said, I'm not going to apologize for defending freedom. Defending freedom? Really? That's how you describe a guy with a vicious secret police who basically, by the way, by suppressing political dissent, he basically forced the dissent into the mosques. And I think we know how that wound up turning out. But Santorum takes an entirely conventional view of this episode, that there's nothing morally wrong with doing this. I don't want to be treated like a 7-year-old, and neither should you. And then he is part of the foreign policy bipartisan establishment that had no problem. He has no problem with the sanctions that were imposed on the Iraqi people, and it's not liberal, it's not leftist to think that maybe it's wrong to prevent baby food and medicines and equipment for repairing the electrical grid or equipment for repairing water treatment facilities to prevent the spread of disease, that maybe there's something wrong with preventing these things from entering the country. But that's exactly what was done. Those items were put on the list with many other items that were not allowed into that country in the 1990s, and the result was absolutely catastrophic for human life. We can't be hypocrites. These people are real people too. Even though the TV says we're not supposed to care about them, or supposed to despise them or ignore them, they are people. And just for a second, I need you to consider the possibility that maybe you've been wrong. That maybe we've too carelessly thought of ourselves first as Americans and only secondarily as Catholics. But as Catholics, we understand there are some things that we cannot do even to people we are told are our enemies. That's a simple Catholic insight. And the war itself, we've got hundreds of thousands of deaths, 4 million people displaced. The rest of the world thinks we've completely lost our minds. This is morally indefensible. And if it makes you feel any better, Hillary Clinton also supported the war. So you can come on my side with Ron Paul and you can be anti-Hillary on everything. But that is what we need to think about right now. And I would say to you that this is not a difficult decision at all. I don't think that we're faced with a whole bunch of wonderful people out there who really just want to turn this country around. Now, I would say most of the people in the American political class are, I don't know, sociopaths. I don't know how to describe it, but they're certainly not on our side. And finally, we have an honest man whom we can trust, who speaks truths, who's willing to be booed if that's what it takes to say maybe we need to have a different foreign policy. Well, I think that's somebody, as a Catholic, we need to support. It should be the easiest decision you ever made. The American political establishment, are you happy with that? Or the man who has stood up to it and stood up for what is moral and right for over 30 years. The choice is obvious, and the question answers itself. For Catholics and for all Americans, Ron Paul for president.